And a final wrap up, and we'll just bring it all home and wrap it up on time by 8:30 at the end of the meeting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask the folks to try and settle in. I'm going to pass the microphone to Brad Buchanan, who's the Executive Director of the Community Planning and Development Department with the City of Denver.
Hi everybody, how are you?
Hi.
Good evening.
Everybody good? Bright light. I just wanted to stop in and say thank you to all of you for your time and your effort and your interest in all of this. Evelyn has done a great job, and Kyle and Sarah and others, and Margie, right? As we go produce this with INC, and I think it's something I think we've felt has worked really well. We want to do more of these, figure out how we can produce these to as many folks as want to be involved and want to learn about this process. As our city grows and we see the velocity of development and investment in Denver, our planning becomes so much more important than we already know it is. And when we are on our best day at community planning and development, our plans, we're facilitating the conversation for you. The plans are your plans. They're not our plans. They're not the mayor's plans. They're your plans. And so as we increase the expertise and understanding and remove the mystery out of the planning process so that stakeholders can be involved in the process at a more substantive level, our plans get better. That's when we have success. We're working really hard at doing that. I'm really proud of what the planning group has done in Golden Triangle, the work they're doing in Arapahoe Square right now. Some really exciting things going on, and as we get more folks expert in our processes, the better the plan results will be, and the better the guidance we have, so that our communities end up being implemented and built like you want them to be. And it's never more clear now than when we're seeing such investment. And as this economy wanes, and it does every time, if things will slow down, that's an even more important time for us to continue to keep the energy up around involvement, keep the energy and interest up around planning, because the next Zoom will happen in a number of years, and we always need to stay ahead of that. The reason that, even though there's been lots of discussion and interest in the development going on in our city now, but I will tell you that, thank goodness, 20, 25 years ago, some really smart people were thinking about Blueprint Denver and really pushing it, because they saw this day coming, and it has guided so much of our development into the areas of change where we wanted it to go. And so the planning, it makes a difference. It really is it truly is what guides the implementation and the regulations and the zoning, and eventually goes down to the building permits themselves. So what you're doing is really, really important, and I just wanted to stop by and say thank you for giving your evenings and your time to this. Tell your friends, and we'll continue to support programs just like this. So thank you.
So an exciting thing that's been happening with the Citizens Planning Academy is in an effort to make the information that's being provided in these sessions available to a broader audience. INC and Margie has worked very closely with her team here to coordinate a video taping of each of the sessions. And so I've just learned that these sessions are now available online. And I kept promising website links to the surveys in case you guys want to take the paper surveys. I've got those here. I'll put this up again. But I also wanted to point out, I've learned that the videos in Session 1 and Session 2 are available online at the denverinc.org. Is that the correct website? Yes. You want to go there to the main website, which is a great resource to learn more about this INC organization, which is, again, a body intended to represent the interests of all of the different registered neighborhood organizations in the city. If you go to the Zoning and Planning Committee page, those videos are there. Well, this camera, I haven't seen them, but I'm sure they're lovely, and I'm sure they all got our good size when they were videotaping this. So So feel free to share that with friends and family. So with that, I am going to change over to our presentation and introduce our presenters. I'm so excited about this next session. I'm a little bit of a zoning geek, fellow planner at heart, but I love zoning, sort of where the rubber hits the road, right? With all the visioning, to get the zoning regulations in place that's going to shape the actual physical development, the physical form that defines each of our neighborhoods, helps to define each of our neighborhoods. So as we've done with all of the sessions, we have co-presenters this evening. We have a member of the CPD staff, but then we also have a member from the community to offer different perspectives on each of our topics. So this evening we're really lucky to have Kyle Dalton, who has been publicly quoted as saying, I love zoning. So that's Kyle. He said it publicly, so now it's fair game. Kyle is a principal planner in the Community Planning and Development in our Planning Services group, and he is the team lead for all of our zoning regulations. And then with him, joining him this evening is Heather Noyes. Heather is a member of the Berkeley Regis United Neighbors registered neighborhood organization. She was very involved in the Denver Zoning Code update in 2010, and then recently has been very involved with her organization in some refinements to the zoning ordinance. So look forward to both of their presentations this evening. With that, pass the mic to Kyle.
I'm going to kick things off, presenting on my own for a little bit, and then Heather and I will parry a little bit as I'm towards the end of my presentation, and then we'll leave it to her to wrap us up. Questions about?
Do you have more handouts?
Are there more handouts?
Yeah. Okay, so you can do it now. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so session 3, session 1 was about citywide planning. You heard about from my colleagues Sarah and Laura. As a citywide scale of planning and smaller area planning last time. This time we're going to talk a little bit about how zoning follows from both kinds of plans. But first I want to start by recalling this slide that Steve Nally, my colleague, used last time about how we implement a plan. So once a plan is adopted, which communicates the community's vision, whether it's a citywide scale or a smaller area scale, we generally bucket the implementation tools of the plan into 3 categories. There are infrastructure investments, there are regulatory changes, and there are partnerships. And some examples of each of those kinds of buckets are on the screen here, and Steve briefly talked about each of them. So in infrastructure, that may be parks, that may be streets, that may be transit stations that a plan calls for. In terms of regulatory changes, it might be landmarking, there might be design standards and guidelines, there may be rules and regulations that affect the streets. Partnerships may involve agencies, private sector development, chambers of commerce, neighborhood organizations, and all of which is to say that a plan talks about all these things and more. I think Joel did a great job last time of talking about how much goes into a plan. We're here tonight to talk about this one little piece within the regulatory bucket called zoning. So zoning is just one of the many tools that we use to implement our adopted plans, and so we're going to dive into one. I suppose there will be 15 other sessions to talk about all the other implementation tools in the city. Specifically, as my colleagues in our neighborhood companions have indicated in the past. Yep. Sure. Okay, I'll take it. I figured you'd get my smiling face back on my profile.
Thank you.
Let's do this. Okay, the viewing audience at home. So, again, you've heard before about how adopted plans express the future vision. The zoning code is the legal means by which we can implement adopted plans. What zoning does is it regulates private land, and it regulates it for construction and land use, and it guides the orderly development of the city. We aim for zoning to be regulations that are clearly communicated what the vision of the city is and how folks can develop within the rules in order to achieve the vision that was communicated through the adopted plans. There are 2 parts to zoning. We're going to talk about each tonight. So the first is that there's the text, or the book, and then there's the map. The 2 go together. Both of them can be found online at denvergov.org/zoning, and we'll get into each of those in just a minute. But first, it's important to talk about what zoning is and what zoning is not. So zoning is the body of regulations that affects the private property. So this picture, taken just around the corner from Heather's office on Tennyson Street, indicates where there's an imaginary line in the ground, Where to the right is the private property. So there's a building, and these folks own, their building is set back a little bit from their private property line. To the left is public right-of-way, street, sidewalk, where the buses go, where there are street trees and benches and trash cans. And everything to the left of this imaginary line in this picture is not impacted by zoning. Zoning cannot regulate what happens on the left side of the line. Zoning only impacts what happens to private property. So the setback in front of the building itself, the construction of the building, the use of the building. That's what we're talking about tonight. So the kinds of things in zoning, the kinds of private property regulations. Some examples include the lot size, how big a lot can be, how wide it has to be. Buildings, how tall they can be, setbacks, bulk plane, where they can be located on the lot. Uses, what you can do inside the building, what you can do on your land. Primary uses, temporary uses, accessory uses. Zoning addresses off-street parking, not on-street, only off-street, for both vehicles and bicycles. Zoning addresses landscaping, grading, so the moving of the lot, and in our residential neighborhoods, for example, the protection of the Denver Hill, in many of our urban residential neighborhoods. Signage, which you do all of these things, and then there's a whole bunch of definitions and rules of measurement for all of these terms when we are using a term that needs definitions separate from the dictionary. So these are the kinds of things that you'll find in zoning. We'll dig into a couple in more detail later on. But wait, it's not that simple. Because in Denver we have two texts. We have one map, but there are two codes in Denver. The first is this, what we call the old code, the former Chapter 59, which still applies to 18% of the land area of the city. And then we have the Denver zoning code, which is the so-called new code that has been in place since 2010, and it applies to 82% of the city. So there are actually two different bodies of rules that apply depending on where you're located on the zone map. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. So first, I need to tell the story of why we have two codes, which is the result of why we created a new code that was adopted at the end of a 5-year process in 2010. Denver's old zoning code, which still applies to 18% of the city, is really mismatched with the community visions that were adopted in the citywide planning at the beginning of the 2000s. In 2000, the Comprehensive Plan 2002 in Blueprint Denver, the community vision that did not align with that former Chapter 59 zoning, which was first adopted in 1956 and then have been added onto over the years. The second thing is that code was complicated to understand, complicated to use, and really complicated to consistently enforce. And so here's a little bit more about why that is. So as I mentioned, the former Chapter 59 was developed in 1956 when Denver had a very different vision. You saw this last time from Steve Dowling. It's a shot of what we thought might happen to where lower downtown is and Union Station, the old rail yards, back in the 1950s. The former Chapter 59 was written as a regulation to implement this kind of thing. Take down, pay no respect to those historic buildings, don't worry about the traditional neighborhood context in the area. We want to see these towers that are distanced from each other and new highways crisscrossing the city. But what we knew from the planning that was done in 2000 and 2002, and the community's articulated vision was that wasn't what we wanted to be in Denver anymore. Instead, what's happened since then is obviously we've preserved Larimer Square, we've invested in Lodo and adopted a historic preservation district in there and kept Union Station. This was what the vision was for the city, but we had an old code that didn't achieve this as one example, but this played out on numerous occasions all over the city. Part of the problem with the old code is that it treats all like uses in the city the same. So one size fits all in the old code. This is an example of in the single unit residential areas, which were generally all zoned R1 or R0 in the old code. 2 zone districts for every flavor of a single unit, whether you were in a kind of more traditional urban neighborhood, bungalow style, before the car was invented. So if you had car access, it was taken from the alley, not coming off with driveways to the detached sidewalks from the street. And the same zoning would apply in our suburban areas that were developed in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, all of which have cars, all of which have garages, all of which have kind of a very different kind of character and building form in the older neighborhoods. Same thing with our commercial zones. So our B2 neighborhood commercial zone district applied equally to our our older 2-story, streetcar type of commercial. That picture's at 38th and Lowell, and it shows a mixed-use building with retail on the ground floor and different use above. And actually, that would no longer have been allowed under the B2 zoning, even though that was a cherished kind of commercial neighborhood. commercial area of the city. And so was this. This is also zone B2, a kind of strip commercial out on Colorado Boulevard, the King Super setback from the street with surface parking. The zoning treated both the same and kind of was aimed towards achieving this rather than achieving that. And not only was our vision mismatched, but the code was complicated. And the reason it was complicated and hard to enforce consistently was because it had been incrementally added to over the years. Every time somebody had a new idea, it would go to council, put a little piece on it, without really thinking about holistically how it affected the code. So from the time of Denver's 1923 ordinance to the former Chapter 59, when it went away for most of the city in 2010, we cobbled together hundreds and hundreds of amendments to the code, which left it really difficult to enforce. Part of the other story of the old code is because it was so complex, it made it hard for property owners to know what they could do on their property, but it also made it unpredictable for neighbors to know what to expect from their property down the street, whether it was vacant or could be redeveloped. The code is that it adds cost, it impacts the affordability of development and housing in our city, it can reduce design quality, and it also makes Denver less competitive. Part of that also is the philosophy of the old code in its method of kind of achieving that vision that I was articulating from before. The old code was based on regulating development through what we call the floor area ratio. And the floor area ratio is a method of controlling the intensity or density of development, and it's based on the amount of land area you have. So I'm going to walk through how that kind of results in different possible developments for a single site. So if this is our property, this kind of gray, I don't know what kind of polygon I would say, here in the middle, and we have in the zoning code an FAR of 4, a floor area ratio of 4. That means that the code would entitle you to build 4 times the square footage of the land area that you have. So if you filled your entire lot from edge to edge because you didn't have any setbacks, you could build 4 stories that match the square footage of the land that you're on. So essentially 4 times the square footage of your property. But that FAR of 4 also means you could build 8 floors if you only cover half the lot, because it's a ratio to the parcel. So if you shrink the buildings to half the lot, you could go twice as high. If you shrink the buildings to a quarter of the lot, you could go up to 16 floors, or, heaven forbid, a 32 floor, with the same FAR, the same basis of regulating development being floor area ratio of 4.0. Again, kind of results in this kind of unpredictability. What is the kind of building going to be on the property? And so as a result, what it does is it prioritizes the regulation of intensity over the notion that buildings should fit into the fabric of an existing community, respond to the context, respond to the shapes and sizes of buildings that are already around them. So the Denver zoning code in 2010 did 2 big things that kind of depart from that old code approach. The first is that the text of the Denver zoning code is context-based, and it's also form-based. I'm going to talk about form-based in just a minute. But in Denver, we have a context-based zoning code now. And what that means is that the regulations vary depending on the neighborhood context that you're in. And what happened in the 2005 to 2010 era, where the zoning code task force and all the community members who participated in the writing of the Denver zoning code identified the characteristics that distinguished different neighborhoods in Denver from each other. So some of the things they looked at included the block patterns and the building placement on the lots, recognizing that some neighborhoods in Denver have more of a grid pattern of blocks, where buildings are more, the primary buildings are closer to the street, with their detached garages along the alleys more commonly in a rectangular shape, and result in that kind of a building pattern. And then there are other areas of the city with a more curvilinear pattern, where there aren't as many detached buildings because your garages were integrated with your house. And there may not have even been alleys because you were just taking vehicle access on the street, kind of an aerial pattern like this. There are also different characteristics between our neighborhoods in terms of how the land is being used and how they're accessed. So, for example, so the top 2 aerials both show commercial areas. On the left is a kind of like an older urban neighborhood, maybe built during the streetcar days, where all the commercial buildings here line both sides of a block and are surrounded by residential within walking distance, just on the other side of the alley. So, our kind of later patterns of development were, under the former Chapter 59, more likely to segregate uses. So the suburban style commercial would be, kind of over here, and the residential would be elsewhere. You'd have to go out and around to get to them. Same thing in terms of parking. the later development, really put an emphasis on the vehicle and having acres of surface parking, and that being the experience that you have as you're walking as a pedestrian down the street. Whereas in some of the older commercial areas, parking was on street and may not actually have been off street at all, or would have been located to the side or to the rear of buildings, rather than in fields of parking. And again, all of these are characteristics that tell us there are different neighborhoods in Denver that should have different kinds of rules. And so these distinguishing characteristics are what resulted in us splitting the city into 6 neighborhood contexts. So these are the 6 neighborhood contexts that are in the Denver zoning code that each kind of represent different combinations of those characteristics that I talked about. And so, and this is the organizing element of the Denver zoning code. The Denver zone districts are all based on which neighborhood context that you're in. I will mention that there's kind of a 7 category off to the side that's special contexts for things that kind of don't fit this. Hospitals, stadiums, that kind of thing. But basically, most of the city is divided into the 6 neighborhood contexts. And it kind of works like this. So the top 3 are primarily single-unit residential in nature. So they range from the suburban neighborhood to the urban neighborhood, and urban edge is in the middle with kind of characteristics of both. But they're primarily single-unit residential. There is commercial development, but it's not the predominant use throughout the neighborhood context. There's also multifamily, but again, they're more often single-unit residential. And then you can see just from the photos, and probably in your mind, some of the differences between them in terms of the orientation of the building, the orientation of parking, and sometimes even mass and scale are different. The latter 3 neighborhood contexts increase in intensity. So first, the general urban neighborhood context is still primarily residential, but rather than being primarily single-unit residential, it's primarily multi-unit residential. Think Capitol Hill, Uptown. Again, mostly residential, some commercial found, but generally a residential kind of neighborhood context of more intensity, more people living per acre. The urban center neighborhood context is truly mixed use. So commercial, retail, shopping, activity, residential included, the live, work, play, kind of all happening often in transit stations. This is a picture of Cherry Creek, which is a classic urban center in Denver, Cherry Creek North. The mixed use part of it, the shopping district area. And then, of course, downtown, the highest intensity. Again, all use is allowed. The focal point for the entire region. And again, the rules are different for development and for uses in each of those contexts. Whereas the former Chapter 59 was that one-size-fits-all approach. Okay, so that's context-based. The second thing about the Denver zoning code is that it's form-based. So instead of being FAR-based, it's form-based. What's that mean? Well, the old code told you what you could do on your property in pages and pages and pages of text. So you'd read through all of these sentences. Your setbacks are 3 feet unless you have a garage, and then it's 5 feet, and you have to kind of comb through it to figure out what the rules were. The form-based code takes a different approach. It uses graphics and tables to tell you what you want. So it shows graphically the kinds of things that are characteristic of the building forms. So the kind of building form, the shape of the building form, the height, the scale of it. And it includes multiple building forms, not all of which are found in all contexts, but we have essentially a menu of building forms that vary from neighborhood context to neighborhood context. Some are in common and some are different, whether it's an urban house, a duplex, a row house, courtyards, and then general commercial building forms. The building forms are designed to set the envelope for what a building, kind of the maximums generally speaking, but at the same time providing flexibility about what happens within that envelope. So, in terms of the design, the materials, the colors, those vary a great deal within the forms, but the forms kind of tell you maximums, setbacks, heights, bulk, that kind of thing. So these 2 things come together to create zoning in Denver. The context is the overall organizing element, what neighborhood context you're in. And then within each neighborhood context, there's a menu of zone districts, from single unit, 2-unit, row house, mixed use, and on up. And then in each of the zone districts are the standards that apply in your zone district. So the standards for your building form, and then also standards for uses and parking. Here's one way that plays out in one of our neighborhood contexts. So at the beginning of the 3rd section of the urban neighborhood context, You'll see all of the zone districts listed on the left-hand side that are found in that context. And across the top are all the building forms that are available in the Denver zoning code. And you can use this chart to quickly see which types of building forms are allowed in your zone district. So if you look, let's say, I said I live in Denver, I'm a homeowner in the URH3A zone district. So I can open up this page of the code and see that in my zone district, the U, which stands for urban, RH, which stands for row house, the 3, which stands for the maximum height of stories, 3 stories, G means and the A means that in some places you can do apartments. I could build an urban house, I could build a detached accessory dwelling unit, I could build a duplex, I could build a tandem house, a garden court, or a row house, and in some cases an apartment. So this table kind of just lays it all out for you in terms of the zone districts and the building forms.
I just wanted to add that as a member of the our neighborhoods RNO, Berkeley, Regis, and a member of the zoning committee, this is a tool that we use almost at every meeting. This table and then the following slide that Kyle will talk to.
This one. So this is an example of one of those building forms. So if I go, here's my district, and I'm not getting known as the district in which I live, and I want to build an urban house, or I already have an urban house, I want to know how I can expand my house. I would turn to the urban house page of the urban neighborhood context, and there would be all my standards. So I've got graphics that illustrate what we mean, and then right side by side on the opposite page are the standards for each zone district for each of the dimensions called out on the graphic. So my height is 2.5 stories or 30 feet. My bulk plane is this. My setbacks are this. Where my garages can go are all, that's all detailed here. Pretty handily, most of what you need to know about building a building or expanding a building are all on kind of this 2-page spread.
Can these be found, like in simple terms, just like this, on your website?
Yeah. So the way this is found on the website. So I started with the urban neighborhood context. My zone district was urban, so I went to the urban neighborhood context article, which is Article 5, and then I opened up the book, and this is a page right out of that article. Yeah. These are literally a screen capture of the code itself. These aren't handouts. This is the code. And then if you can't find it, right there on our zoning page, denver.org/zoning, are the contact information for the zoning staff to help walk it through, both in emails and phone numbers. Those are on there. So I spent a lot of time talking about building forms because the form-based code, really what's most important about the form-based code is those building forms are designed to ensure that buildings better fit in with their context rather than that FAR kind of multiple choice possibility, ensuring that building forms are consistent down a block or in a neighborhood. That's a form-based approach, but the Denver zoning code still addresses uses and parking and other things. Even though it's form-based, it's not only about form. So we still have a list of uses that are allowed in the zone district: single unit, 2 unit, multiple unit, retail, restaurant, industrial, commercial kitchen facility. So there are still use tables in the zoning code that come along with parking requirements, and then also articulate what you have to do to get a permit to do that use. And then some uses have additional requirements that we call use limitations that go with them. So, for example, sometimes if you're opening a restaurant very near to a residential zone district, you may have limits on your hours of operation. Or you may have to have an additional procedure with notice to the neighbors before you can open an outdoor patio, that kind of thing. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the text of the code. That's the body of the body. I was going to bring the book as an example today, but I didn't bring the book. But it is as big as I showed you on that picture. I'm going to transition to talking about the map now. When we mapped the city in 2010, we used 3 criteria for that first go of the zoning map. I'm going to talk about that first, and then we'll talk later about how the map changes over time. But in 2010, when we were looking at remapping the entire city, we looked at 3 different things to create that map. So the first was what was already on the ground. What were the existing conditions? What was the context? What were the land uses there? What were the buildings? How big were they? What was the scale of them? So what was already there was sometimes a determinant of what the zone district should be. The second thing was, what were they zoned before? That zoning conferred certain property rights and an entitlement that went along with it. And And even though that wasn't always aligned with our vision, that also set an expectation for some property owners about what they could do with their property, so we weighed that criterion too. And then the third was the plan recommendations. What did Blueprint Denver say? What did the small area plan say? Was that pointing in a different direction than the other two, or were they all in alignment? Those were the three criteria that we used, and over the course of 25 public meetings in every city council district in the city, where it had been broken out by neighborhood within each of those meetings, we received the feedback from the public about what that map should look like for different areas of the city in a way to balance those three criteria. But there were the parts of the city that I talked about before that are still in the former Chapter 59, that 18% of the city that's using the old book. Those things are the things that we left alone because they were too complicated to unravel. So those were site-specific customizations in the maps, such as PUDs, which are planned unit developments, individually negotiated rules. It's like an entire body of zoning code that applies to a single parcel or a single group of parcels. And my slide's showing up on the screen, but there are other things like waivers and conditions and planned building groups, things that have been individualized and were not a standard zone district. And there are literally actually over 1,000 of those individualizations in the city, and we didn't touch them because that was too much to unpack at that time. So they kept their old zoning until such time as they rezoned. Some of them opted into the new zoning at the time, but mostly those stayed as they were. So let me kind of take through a couple examples of how that mapping worked, and then we'll talk about the code as a whole and how we amended it. So again, existing conditions, current zoning, and plan recommendation. Here's an example where everything was alignment and it was easy to figure out how to zone it. So let's imagine a neighborhood with all single unit structures, all single family homes, detached homes. The zoning at the time was R1 or R0, which is a single family zone district. And the plan recommendation from Blueprint Denver said that the future concept land use for the area was single family residential. Well, 1, 2, 3, they're all in alignment. Now all I have to do is pick which single unit district from our new menu should apply. So if the zoning's R1, the plans is showing single family, we have a new menu of different single unit zone districts based on your lot size, but it's still pretty simple to pick how that should be mapped overall. And so those usually got some kind of single unit zoning. It's not always that easy. There are a lot of areas of the city where the three criteria were not in alignment, and those were our mismatch areas. And so in a very similar situation, but slightly different circumstances, resulted in a different outcome on the map. So for example, there are neighborhoods of our city where it's a lot of single unit structures, but varying lot sizes mixed in with duplexes and small apartment buildings. That happened a lot in what used to be zoned R2. R2 was a multifamily zone district. We didn't have a duplex zone district in the old code. If you had enough land, you could build multiple family in the R2 zone district. So some of our neighborhoods had that kind of mixed condition. But the plan was still recommending a future land use of single family residential. Well, what do you do with a mixed existing condition, current zoning, multifamily, plan saying the future concept is single family? That played out differently in different areas of the city, again, based on the impact or the input from neighborhoods. So this is an example of the Platt Park neighborhood, where we had that condition where it was R2 in this orange area for the western 2/3 of the residential part of the neighborhood, which is, again, multifamily. And then the R1 in the eastern third-ish, which is single family, but Blueprint Denver was saying single family residential for the whole thing, not just for the eastern part. How do you reconcile those kind of differences? Well, we had a number of choices in the new code, so we have a much richer menu of zone districts in the new code to choose from. And it played out at times, even though there were existing buildings that were duplexes and on up, and the zoning was R2, sometimes the choice was to go with a single unit zone district and implement the plan. Sometimes that's where it was weighted best. There may be different lot sizes, but generally one single unit. Sometimes now we have zone districts in the code that allow accessory dwelling units. Some people call them granny flats, or it could be a basement apartment, it could be a detached unit above a garage in the rear. Smaller, cannot be separated legally in ownership from the primary unit, but kind of allows a little bit of a bridge of the gap between what used to be allowed in multifamily, but still is respectful of the single-family character of the neighborhood. Sometimes that's what got applied, and that's actually what happened in much of Platt Park. We also created a zone district that has single unit with ADUs, but allows duplexes at certain locations. There are parts of the city where it was common for us to find duplexes on corners, on the avenues, on the numbered avenues, not on the streets. And so there are a couple zone districts in the city that are mostly single unit but allow you a duplex if you're on a particular corner. Or in some cases, they picked a 2-unit zone district, which would allow a duplex or a tandem house, a house behind another house on the same lot, not necessarily attached to each other. And so that was the right choice in some neighborhoods. And that played out the same way in multi-unit residential and commercial, even in industrial, where we had more choices in the new code that we had to pick from based on those 3 criteria. So that kind of played out in a number of different scenarios around the city. And I would go through all of them, but unfortunately, everyone's only give us an hour, and even though I'm zoning, well, I gotta be on time, so I'm gonna keep going. So a couple points overall about the code, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Heather. The first is that the Denver zoning code, even though it has a form-based and context-based approach, it does not lock in design. So the code alone, the zoning code alone, doesn't lock in an architectural style. These are examples within the same kind of single-unit zone district. One has a hipped roof, one has a flat roof. One, different styles, different eras that they were built in. The Denver zoning code isn't going to distinguish between the two or require a certain kind of architectural style. It does allow for kind of reinvestment over time to accommodate demand and facilitate change in ways that are compatible. But as long as, again, you're meeting your bulk, your setbacks, that envelope of the building form that I talked about, the code isn't going to dictate a kind of HOA covenants kind of commonality of architectural design in a particular zone district on its own. A couple more points about the code. So first, with all the conversation happening in Denver right now about housing affordability, I want to talk a little bit about what the Denver zoning code did about affordable housing. So first of all, the form-based approach is creating more choices. Right before, we just had a single unit or a multi-family, and there was kind of nothing in between. Now, by virtue of there being more options to choose from on the zoning map, sometimes a neighborhood that might be more sensitive to apartments or condos can find a 2-unit or row house district that would allow the construction of more units than otherwise. So that's one way in which the code fosters affordability in Denver as compared to the old code. It also removes a lot of barriers. Really, the new code takes the approach of let's get out of the way of the market and affordable housing pillars in order to no longer be overly restrictive. So the old code had a minimum lot size everywhere, under this 1950s notion that a family of 4 needed 6,000 square feet to raise a good family and the boy and the girl to have a backyard space to play in. But we have wonderful neighborhoods in Denver with lots that are smaller. Curtis Park is still an outstanding neighborhood to raise a family in, and a lot of those lots are 3,000, 4,000 square feet. So the new code created new minimum lot sizes that are smaller than 6,000 square feet in some cases, which again will incrementally allow more units to be built. I mentioned before about how the form standards have replaced the old arbitrary limitations, which provides a little bit more certainty about what's buildable. And it also, based on local demand studies of parking and an independent third-party consulting study of parking, it changed the parking requirements for off-street parking and made them vary based on the context. So we've never had parking requirements downtown, but 1 foot out of downtown, we would have the same parking requirements that you would have in a suburban location. Today, the parking requirements vary based on the neighborhood context. So if you're in a neighborhood context, greater access to the multimodal transportation network of the city, where folks are choosing to take transit, maybe there's better bicycle options, those parking ratios are lower than they are in our suburban locations where they are higher. So the parking ratios, which sometimes set a parking ratio that was higher than what was actually being used, what the market demanded, what people were actually driving, forced folks to build more parking than ever got parked on. That generates cost, and that increases the price of housing. So by varying the parking based on the context, that actually also removes one of the barriers to affordability based on that study. But all of this is to say the zoning just tries to get out of the way, but the zoning alone is not going to solve Denver's affordable housing problem. Right? Affordability is way more than how big your building can be on your lot, which is what zoning regulates. There are a lot of other tools that other departments are also included in ensuring that we're actually addressing the city's housing issues. And then I'll say a little bit about the philosophy of the code to sustainability, because again, the code was trying to look towards the future and improving the ongoing sustainability of Denver's development. So some of the things that that the code does by taking a context-based approach to respecting the standards based on the existing character of an area. What that actually does is it promotes the retention of existing buildings, and in many ways, the most sustainable building is the building that's already built. All energy that went into the building itself. And so, to the extent that the code promotes keeping our older buildings in place and not promoting the wholesale tear down and building of new buildings, that's actually more sustainable, even if the new building were a LEED Platinum building. And then a number of other things in the code seek to promote long-term sustainability, such as allowing car sharing, promoting bicycle use, bicycle parking standards citywide for the first time, allowing a lot more urban agricultural uses so people can grow their own food on their home, and now we can sell in some cases, homegrown produce, by virtue of some of the requirements that we've done to reduce the parking requirements, that reduces the runoff and the water quality problems that result from the water that runs off of our parking lots when they're covered with oil and gas. And then solar access is also ensured in many of our districts to, again, make sure that sun kind of gets into people's yards and creates access to the open space. But again, zoning is just kind of one thing. There are a lot of different things that the city's got to do in order to ensure we have a sustainable future. Okay, so we talked a lot about the zoning code, the map, the text, and the map. But if you like irony as much as I do, I appreciate it. Nothing is written in stone. And when I say that, it's because both the text and the map are always subject to change. And this was an important point. I remember Peter Park saying in almost every public meeting when we were doing the Denver zoning code, like, we're going to get it the best we can now, but we're going to keep improving. We're going to keep coming back to it. We're going to keep taking a look at it and amending it over time. And some of the things we do in terms of amendments, just broadly speaking, amendments to the code help to close loopholes and errors that we find. Every now and then, someone's going to find something that we never thought of before and walk through and build this ugly building that should not have been able to be built in the first place. So sometimes we're correcting errors that were unintentional. Sometimes the code needs to adapt to the changing marketplace, the changing circumstances. Probably the most obvious example of that over the past 5 years has been marijuana. But there are a lot of other things as the market and demands change. Or to implement the newly adopted plan direction. If a neighborhood plan comes in and is adopted and contemplates a different direction for a neighborhood, then it's important to go back to the zoning and change the zoning to implement that neighborhood plan so that the rules are no longer out of sync with the neighborhood vision adopted in that plan. So there are two ways that amendments happen, and there are some of the most public processes the city does. We amend the map, which a lot of people call rezoning, or you can amend the text too. So here's, goodness gracious. Here's kind of just the basics of how amendments work. Map amendments, you can find all current map amendments and a whole explanation of what it is to go through a map amendment process online at denver.gov.org/rezoning. Those of you who are members or who are contact people for your registered neighborhood organizations get notices often from the city about rezonings because we provide notice 4 different times to a registered neighborhood organization about what's pending rezoning. And they always point to that website, so that website should be familiar to those of you who are involved in RNOs. It's the public process by which you change the map, you change the zoning for a specific piece of land. A parcel, multiple parcels, a portion of a parcel, changing it from one zone district to another. That's what a map amendment is. Changes the rules for structures, uses, and parking and run-in. It's a minimum 4-month, more typically 6-month process. 10 steps, 4 public meetings, 2 public hearings. The only people who can approve this at the end of the day are your city council members. Same thing for text amendments. It actually follows the same process in terms of 4 public meetings, 2 public hearings, must be adopted by city council. What the difference is it's a change to the body of the code, it's a change to the language, it's a change to the standards, it's a change to the allowed uses within the zone district. That doesn't apply to a particular piece of property. But again, the same kind of process. And here's where I'm going to turn it over to Heather. So she can talk about how they get involved in those processes.
Great. Should I? Oh, I have to give this right back to you.
Oh,
Next
yeah,
couple.
I'll talk over here.
Do you want questions now or?
I think we're going to take them at the end.
We
I'm
have
not
other
nearly as
mics.
articulate as Kyle, so I'm just, so, like
like I said, my name's Heather Noyes, and I am on the R&O for Berkeley Regis United Neighbors. I'm also on the zoning committee. And some of the tasks that we are asked to do as a zoning committee is we receive information directly from the city and county of Denver pretty much every day. Some of it applies to zoning, some of it's public notice. We receive requests for variances, and we review those. We often will go out and knock on neighbors' doors if we feel that the issue warrants that kind of effort and solicit feedback. And then depending on the decision that we make as a committee, we refer that to the board and we'll get the board's approval. We either will write a letter of support or a letter of opposition, or in our case, we've made a concerted effort to respond to every request. And so sometimes we write a letter and say we will take no stance at this time. So we want the city as an R&O to know that we are aware of the issue and we have reviewed it. So those are the three letters that we will forward. Some of the issues we are asked to address are fence heights, garage setbacks, slight modifications in small structures in the back, and different maybe variances in setbacks to the main structure. We are also asked to review requests for liquor licenses and modifications to those licenses, but I need to tell you that that has nothing to do with zoning. But those, as a member of the zoning committee, we're asked to look at those. We review requests for rezoning. We attend planning board hearings. We attend city council hearings. We look at potential changes to the map, and we will supply written comments as we did most recently in the case of the bundle text amendment. We wrote a letter, submitted that to CPD staff, and then went to planning board and city council. So we're going to kind of drill down in the next few minutes and take a very detailed look at the Tennyson Street corridor. And I should back up a little bit. The Berkeley Regis United Neighbors, simply put, our boundaries are from 38th to 52nd, and then from Federal to Sheridan. There's one tiny inn holding Harkness Heights, is an older established neighborhood, and they have their own R&O, but it's very, very big. And we have we have different character of residential development and commercial development within our boundaries. So Kyle's going to talk a little bit about the zoning on Tennyson Street.
Sure. Just have the history to you where you are. Thank you for giving me that. So I'm going to walk through kind of the history of what's happening here. This is just a slide kind of explaining each of the next slides, and we'll get to. Why don't you go to the next slide? There we go. So the first zoning map that we have, that I've got in my wall, my cubicle, is the old zoning from 1925 that was revised in 1944. And the first zoning that we have record of on Tennyson Street, which is the blue vertical strip in the center of that slide, kind of was intended to follow along the streetcar line, which is the dashed red lines. Those are the old streetcars. Initially went out to Lakeside Amusement Park, just to the left of the screen there, and then off to Golden and beyond. The old zoning map then had just one business zone district. It was the B business zone district, and it mapped the same district along the whole that whole area, even where there were no businesses built yet, and some existed, and some actually were residences. But the idea was, along the streetcar line, we're going to have business zoning. That was the first stab at zoning. The second, which was the 1956 zoning, under the former Chapter 59 I've talked a lot about, broke that area into two. So it recognized there are different kinds of businesses in the city, and it split Tennyson Street into B3, north of 44th, a less intense business zone district, and then B4, south of 44th, which was a more intense business district. So the B3 area was still mostly actually single-family residential on the ground, but it enabled mixed uses, business uses over time if they wanted to. There are some businesses from that era, but it's mostly residential. The B4 were more intense. And then also, the 1956 map recognized, there's a park too at 41st in Tennyson. In 2010, we got an even richer menu of zone districts. We were able to go to an even finer grain of detail than the 1 district, the 2 district. Now there are 5. 5 different areas that are mapped with 3 different districts and different combinations, on not including the park, which is still there too. So there's an urban mixed use, 3-story zone district, generally north of 44th and then south of 44th and 41st. There's an urban Main Street, 3-story district, which the Main Street districts do a better job of requiring transparency at the ground floor through windows and doors and the like to better gauge the pedestrian street light. They have the uses that you do on the ground floor to not be just parking or mini storage. Now, and so they're kind of a more evolved form of mixed-use development, I guess you could say. And then there's an urban Main Street 5 stories, so there's even a 5-story district towards the south end of the corridor. And they're all mapped, kind of, again, based on extensive feedback from others. We can talk more about that in the 2010 supplement.
Great. So over in Tennyson Street and in our neighborhood, we are seeing unprecedented change and unprecedented growth. And back in 2007, our councilman, Rick Garcia, was able to allocate funding under the 2007 bond for improvements to Tennyson Street, streetscape improvements. And so it really set the foundation, and everybody was very, very hopeful that once that project was completed, there would be interest in private reinvestment along our commercial corridor. Well, that certainly has happened both in our residential districts and in our commercial districts. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that we're facing over with respect to both those uses. We are looking at, I'm just going to go really quickly through these and dive into detail in a minute, but we're going to talk a little bit about front porches and the role that they have in residential neighborhoods, the massing and scale of new structures going up in established older neighborhoods, and then also street trees and the character of our streets. With respect to commercial infill and redevelopment, we're looking at what's happening, what are the uses going in at street level, and we call that, or the city calls that activation along the street, what that looks like, transparency, are there doors, are there a lot of windows, what the materials are like, and then also the pedestrian environment. And going back to one of Kyle's very first slides, those are the improvements that go on the public land, on the right side, on the left side of that slide, the street, the sidewalk. So with respect to the front porch, we're seeing a lot of new single-family and duplex development, and there is no porch. And what has come to our attention at our R&O meetings and at our zoning committee meetings is that people are seeing more and more people moving in with less people out on the street. And we refer to that as eyes on the street. And it limits the amount of impromptu exchanges. So many of these homes, especially on the top row, will have a 2-car garage in the back. So the new residents will leave their house through the back door, they come home through the back door, and we see very little, there's very little exchange of people sitting on the stoop or on the front porch. And it has impacted our sense of community over there, especially on the streets where we're seeing a lot of change and a lot of redevelopment. And this little stoop up here is something that somebody brought to our attention, that they don't even have a place for their milk box. So we see that quite a bit in some of the new developments. We have the 43rd on the east side of the street. We have single-family, older bungalows. And on the west side of the street is what we kind of affectionately non-affectionately, I should say, refer to as our Macaroni Grill Row. And these are all duplexes going up pretty much the entire block. All the homes have been demolished, and this is what's going up on the west side. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the details that we're addressing here. The height. So these duplexes are being built in a zoning code that permits 2.5-story buildings. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about how they're being able to build what looks to everybody over there like 3 stories. But If you walk down the sidewalk, it's readily apparent to every passerby that they have a main floor, a second floor, and a third floor. There's enclosed space on the third floor and a lot of walkout balconies. So we really see that as a 3-story structure. We have enormous kind of penetrations into the setbacks. So your eaves are allowed to penetrate into your 5-foot setbacks. And if you combine the size of the eaves with some of the columns that are being used for front porches, suddenly these buildings just look monolithic. And then very few new street trees are being planted. And again, going back to something Kyle said, if you look, everything on that left side of the sidewalk is public right-of-way. So the zoning code does not cover improvements in there, but we are, as an R&O, we have formed a public works committee, and we're starting to look at why the existing streetscape design guidelines aren't being implemented and what we can do to advocate for more street trees within the residential and also commercial districts in our neighborhood. And here is an example on the left of a tree lawn with street trees and what's being allowed and built, and seems to be very, very prevalent with new development. We're getting a lot of gravel mulch, and that really contributes to glare and loss of shade. So with respect to commercial redevelopment, again, these issues are street activation and what is happening at the we have this is the old Tennyson hardware store, some of you might remember, has been recently renovated into commercial space. They've done a really great job of keeping some of the old masonry detailing. Adaptive reuse, this was an old Quonset hut on Tennyson Street that's now become a brew pub and restaurant. But on the right side, in the same section of the street, we're seeing split-level multi-family development where there's really no interest at pedestrian interest along the street. And then on the lower right, this also is on Tennyson Street with really a lot of people saying, why are these buildings turning their back to our street? Why are there no doors? Why are there no porches? How are they allowed to have these curb cuts here on our main commercial corridor through Berkeley? Adjacency issues. So we have, as I was talking to Becca a little bit earlier, we have existing single-family homes, many of which have been converted to commercial use, so that's adaptive reuse. But some of these are getting scraped, and they're going down pretty fast, and what's going up are 5 to 7 unit townhomes oriented. They're not perpendicular to the street. So what goes up adjacent to these single-family homes are 3.5, 4-story structures, all of which have windows and balconies looking onto these adjacent homes and businesses on Tennyson Street. So there's a loss of privacy, there's a loss of solar access now, especially if these are built to the south. And then we also are seeing a complete, we would call this the Great Wall of China here, where the foundation for a 3 to 4-story structure with no windows, no penetrations, is allowed to be set right on the property line going all the way up to the street. Transparency and activation. These are some issues that have been addressed, that we are talking about and have recently been addressed. The curb cuts along Tennyson Street. This is a requirement for transparency. Am I right, Kyle, or is that activation? The door.
The door, yeah.
Transparency. So I think Evelyn was with us when we were walking by this development, and we went to open the glass had been the glass wasn't frosted yet, and it conceals a fire hose. It's not a door. And then the address, it says Berkeley Park with the street number on there, has been used as to meet the activation requirement, and they call it public art. So many of these issues have been recently addressed by the bundle number 1 text amendment that was passed by City Council this year. So we went through and looked very carefully at what the community planning and development department was proposing. We looked at the issues that we had been addressing at our R&O, and we were really thrilled. We did go back and forth. It was definitely a kind of a compromise for us. We didn't get everything we wanted, but here's my little activation. You know, and this is Tennyson Street. This is Tennyson Street, just north of 44th. This is the primary pedestrian connection between our commercial core and our library in Berkeley Park and Centennial Elementary and Rec Center. And now we have these pinch points because the development has been allowed to come right up to the property line. We have teeny tiny pinch points, 5-foot sidewalk, and less than 5 feet of gravel or tree lawn, I guess that's called. So if in the future the city wanted to come back and do streetscape improvements, you have very, very little to work with here to improve the connection between our commercial core and Berkeley Park.
Right, these been grandfathered in then essentially because it was before the textual amendment.
That's right. Yeah. Let me just jump on this real fast before you go on to the next slide. These are things that we've taken colloquially, and it's not a zoning term, but we've calling them the fro homes, the faux row homes. We're the row homes, but they're turning their shoulder. They're not really being friendly neighbors, turning their doors to the street. And I don't think Heather's given herself enough credit. I think she's just talked a little bit about what their neighborhood did, but the city's text amendment that she was referencing and we did earlier in June directly addressed a lot of these issues, was the direct result of the work that the neighborhood did in identifying the issues and presenting them to the city and saying, here's an example of why this isn't working and here's how to fix it. And like you said, a lot of that, not all of it, but some of it got changed back in June.
So, I've showed several slides of things that we are really trying to address, go through, and have been addressed through the bundle. And as I mentioned, we didn't get everything we wanted, so we're moving forward at Berkeley Regis United Neighbors with an overlay district. And so the front porch issue, massing and scale, activation and transparency in commercial redevelopment, those are topics that we want covered within our overlay district. And so we've had, and it's taken a while, I've now been working on a series of public meetings. We've whittled down the topics. We want this to be really, really simple. We want to work very closely with development inspection services because the success of our overlay district is going to depend on community planning and development and site inspectors and how easy they can be implemented. We also understand that some of these issues you will have to compromise, and we're trying to build in a series of incentives into our overlay district. So if a resident wants to build a structure that maybe is a little bit bigger or taller than what our overlay district calls for, would that owner be willing to have a larger setback? So we're looking at all these different trade-offs, both in residential properties and also in the commercial district. And we'd really like to build into our overlay district incentives to work with the development community. And then I really wanted to leave you with, positive, and there's a lot of really great stuff going on, and I need to celebrate that with you tonight. We have really wonderful new single-family homes. We have great duplexes. The image in the upper right corner is a modular home, prefab, that's brought in with a crane. But the scale is small enough, and the setback's big enough, and it fits right in with the adjacent bungalows. We have great new front porches, and then on the lower left, really high-quality mixed-use development going in on Tennyson. So not all is lost, but we feel we as a neighborhood can take the time and the effort and just create kind of a tighter little package of regulations to ensure that new development really respects the existing context. I think that's one.
Yeah, that's it. So, yeah, the idea that I think to wrap up with from Heather is that this is your city, this is your neighborhood. There's so much the CPD can do, but there's a whole lot that you can do as volunteers to of bringing attention to your particular issues in your neighborhood, or also to do the heavy lifting of the work to figure out what it should be and how the rules can better work to implement the vision in your community. So your city, your tools, use them.
Great. Thank you.
So we are running a tight schedule. We're about 4 minutes ahead of schedule, actually. So we have an opportunity now if you want to ask a few questions before, or we can just take a 10-minute break and add those 4 minutes on the Q&A after break. I'm already seeing hands going up, so you want to take a few questions now, we'll take a break. And you want to just take the 10 minutes of questions now and then go to break? Yeah. Let's do that. All right. Is that okay for you?
Sure.
Okay. All right. I'll let you go ahead and choose your. Go ahead.
Well, I had a question about the setbacks and this new bundled text amendment, because what I'm seeing around the city, but particularly with the new development that's going on along 8th and Cherry, that they're building these apartments right up to the sidewalk. There is no setback, and you look at the new RH building in the Cherry Creek area, it's right up the street. So in terms of pedestrian walking and so forth and so on, what can we do to prevent that kind of claustrophobic building that's occurring? Because it seems like they're trying to maximize their space for as much square footage as possible.
Sure, so maybe I'll take that. You guys take that. So there are times when it's desirable to have a 0-foot setback from the public right of way, and there are times when it's not appropriate, right? So in Larimer Square, for example, those buildings sidewalk and we're crossing this empty land or parking, that wouldn't be a good thing. There we do want buildings to meet the street, meet the sidewalk, and walk right into the gauge. But then there are other places, particularly the residential uses, where setbacks make sense. And so I think what it comes down to is, does the zoning implement the plan, right? Is the plan for the area calling for this, or is it calling for that? And then it's a matter of picking the right tool to solve the problem. So there are a lot of different ways to address whatever that particular issue is. It may be that it's mapped wrong, and a rezoning is what's appropriate. A different zone district that would have the right setbacks and building form standards would be the right solution for that problem, for that area. It may be that the standard is wrong. And everywhere in the city that has that same zoning, the setback is only 5 feet and it should be 10. And so that's a text amendment, and you want to go in and do that. Heather mentioned an overlay. Overlay is a tool when you want to have a set standard, certain standards that apply across multiple underlying zone districts, so it lays over top of multiple. So an overlay is one way where if this were a problem in both a row house and a multi-unit townhome or whatever, just zone districts, but the solution for one particular issue or the same thing would be an overlay. But the tool just kind of depends on what the particular thing is. It may be any of those, or probably a few others I can have.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
If someone wanted to rezone a property and it conflicts with easement Denver and or the neighborhood plan, what happens? Is that something that still would be passed with, or would someone have to oppose it and point it out, or is that something that kind of gets handled through CPD and the planning board to say, wait, this actually conflicts?
Sure. Good question. So I talked about the three criteria from 2010, which we were doing a citywide thing, and it was a legislative effort. We weren't evaluating a particular property one at a time. There are different criteria under the current code when you're rezoning a single property, and you're going before the council and you're asking them for permission to change the zoning of your property. One of the 5 criteria that are in the code for most rezonings, the very first one is that it must be consistent with the city's adopted plans. So it's not one of 3 factors to balance, it's a requirement. Where it's tricky is the interpretation of that plan, right? The plan language communicates a vision, but it may not always be clear. It's certainly not going to get to the detail of the setback should be 5 feet or should be 7 feet, or something like that. But it may, particularly a more generalized vision that under any interpretation isn't consistent with the zone. In which case, both staff would recommend to council, and hopefully council would deny that kind of an application. The devil's in the details of the plan, actually says.
Yeah. So a tag on to that, you had talked about when, and I live in the Bluebell neighborhood and we have a new neighborhood plan. And a lot of the zoning recommendations in the neighborhood plan are not consistent with the actual zoning that's in place. So you talked a little bit about getting, or that rezoning should happen to implement the plan, but I don't really understand how that happens. You just have to wait for a property owner to want to do that? Or does something else happen?
That's another great question, yeah. So the Globeville plan actually recommends in its implementing language, those 3 buckets I started with at the very beginning, it recommends that one of the regulatory tools should be that there should be a legislative rezoning, which is when the council themselves take it upon themselves to change the zoning over a wide area in order to implement the plan. It takes the leadership of the council person to initiate that zoning and change the map. Until that happens, or unless that happens, individual property owners one at a time can apply to the city and ask, in Globeville. I've got one going to committee next week, actually, in Globeville, to implement the plan. So it could happen kind of either one of those 2 ways.
Okay, so then when, like, the person who is rezoning now, do they have to comply with the current zoning or the recommended zoning of the plan that hasn't been implemented?
If they are developing or using their property today under their current zoning, their property rights go with the current zoning district, not what the plan calls for. So until they are rezoned, they can develop however they can under the current zoning.
Okay, thank you.
You know, I'm going to chime in here real quick and just offer another observation, just an opportunity to dispel a common urban planning myth, and that is that, you know, that whatever any zoning request that comes through, the staff will just make it so. It's like an Oprah Winfrey show. It's like you get a rezoning and you get a rezoning, and that's not the case. So we have a graphic somewhere here, and I can try and pull it up during the break, that shows sort of the winnowing process that happens behind the scenes before you get to any of those public meetings, before you get to any of those public hearings. It's a very small percentage. We are able to winnow it down to, so your original question is, what if it's like you're asking for this, but the plan, you know, you're asking for A, but the plan is very clear. It says you get B, or we want B to happen here. In those instances, there's a lot of conversations that happen before the application is able to move forward, where staff will say, like, dude, look, you got A and the plan says B. This has like a snowball's chance. Let's work with you. Let's figure out something that's closer to B. So you have an application that is more in line with the community's vision. So we have a lot of those conversations before we even bring anything to the planning board. That isn't to say someone can't say, no, I want A. I don't care if your plan says B, I want A. So everybody gets their day in court. In those instances, they're rare, but in those instances, those cases can move forward with a recommendation for denial, because staff can only make a recommendation for approval. I have another one of my funnel graphics somewhere that shows the process that happens behind the scenes before the plans, before the rezoning request made before a public body for action. So that's my 2 cents there. Gentleman in the back, it's Floyd, is that right?
One question, 3-part. Zoning committee. How many members make up the zoning committee? What is their term that they serve, and how are they, or who are they appointed by?
The registered neighborhood organizations, zoning committee?
Zoning committee, yeah, that is R&O. So each R&O has their own zoning committee.
Yeah.
That dictates what happens in their R&O.
We do have a zoning committee and we have a chairman. At the R&O level, we are very dependent on our pool of volunteers, and we never have enough people, ever. So right now, Bruin just had to accept the resignation of David Decker, who is our chair, he would get phone calls from the development community, he would get phone calls from property owners. Everybody in our neighborhood knows David. He's very visible, he carries around the zoning code, and he knows the zone districts like the back of his hand, and he knows those, if you remember those 2 slides with those spreadsheets and matrices on them, we see those at every meeting. So we have to fill his shoes, and so we're trying to figure out whether that's one individual, whether we have co-chairs. One thing that happened, and so we don't have a certain number of people, we don't have terms at the committee level. At the board level we do, but at the committee level we're just very dependent on a very small pool of people, and always recruiting new members.
So that's on the registered neighborhood organization side, which is very grassroots, it's volunteer based, it's your neighborhood residents, and you all figure out how many people you want on your zoning committee. And on the city side, we have our planning board, which is an appointed body. And those folks do have some authority to make recommendations to the city council for final decisions. And there's, I'm trying to count the member seats.
11,
There's 11 members on the planning board, and they are appointed by the mayor.
3-year terms.
3-year terms.
Thank you.
I just had a quick clarification question, probably for Heather. When you're talking about this overlay district, it sounded like there was the potential that you would be able to require any new development to have a front porch. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what we're working through right now. And it's really, you think right out of the gate it would be easy, but as we start talking about that, like, do we want to really say for a single family, and these are all ideas that have been tossed on the table, do we want to mandate a 6-foot deep porch so that you can have furniture and somebody can sit in the chair and walk by the chair? Do we want to use a proportion? Can we say does the front porch needs to be 66% of the length of the facility? These are all little drawings that we have out on the table. Or, and also, we have homes that I have patios, and those accomplish the same goals: impromptu exchanges, eyes on street. So, in the case of our overlay district, the one the draft is right now, it says porch or patio. What we're really struggling with is, do we mandate a size? Do we really want to go as far as say a size? And if we don't say a size, then the stoop that I showed you that doesn't even fit the mailbox could meet the requirements of front porch. So those are the details that we're trying to work out right now.
We're also looking through 2 stories, 2-story porch, right? If it wraps around, is it still a porch? If they move blinds, is it still a porch? It gets complicated pretty quick, and how since there's no permit for just laying concrete on the ground, it's not a structure, how would you enforce and protect it if it was just a patio on the porch? You know, it's not as simple as saying, thou shalt be a porch.
But we have one member.
Private property rights that zoning could never infringe upon? Like, are there things that are like, you just can't make rules about this? Or if enough people in your neighborhood show up at the meetings and say we want, everyone has to have an Adirondack chair on their front porch, just to be extreme, but.
Well, we've been working on this for over a year, and we want the support of all of our members and the residents within our boundary and our property owners and the development community. We're fortunate to have members of the development community on our board, and it's very important when we go to our city council person and then we go to the planning board, we go to city council, we say, you know what, we had all these meetings, and this is what we did at the meetings, and we did this survey, and we heard from these people, so that we have kind of this body of evidence that says we have the majority of the support of our neighborhood behind us, and we have documented that. So if we came out and said every single house has to have an orange Adirondack chair on the porch, I don't think, well, I would vote for that, so we would have one person. But whether you would rally enough people that you could really prove to the planning board that everybody, most of the people in Berkeley support that. So it's a complete give and take, and we have tried. What we've done is we've taken a huge number of issues and we've really boiled it down to these 4. There's 4 main issues in our neighborhood: the porches, the massing and scale, the activation and the transparency, and then the 2 other issues are on the other side of the private property line. So those are in the public right away. So if people ask me how many issues our RML is going to address within our overlay district, I will say 4. And we're really trying to keep it simple. No. Front porches, massing and scale. And that's an umbrella term. I mean, that's really big. So massing and scale. So those 2 fall under the residential heading. And then under your commercial heading, we're addressing activation at the street level and transparency.
By activation means the uses.
The uses at street level, and then what those uses look like.
Okay, I'm going to be the timekeeper again. I'm happy to continue on with questions, but I want to make sure that we have time for a break and for an exercise that we have planned, that hands-on exercise. So I've got the agenda on the screen here. We're scheduled to start the exercise at 7:30. It's 7:20 right now. Y'all want a 10-minute break? Okay, let's take a 10-minute break.
Are we going to get back to more questions?
I think it is.
Those folks will be there to receive those awards. So it's a great opportunity to just kind of celebrate what's happening in Denver. It's great about architecture and planning and all that good stuff that we love. So it's 6 o'clock tomorrow night at the Ellie Hawkins, what's it called, the Grant?
You'll figure it out. It's 6 o'clock.
Donald Sewell.
In the city of Denver. Yes.
Our website is denvergov.org/MDA, Mayor's Design Award. And all of the information about the event and the awards will be on there tomorrow. And we hope you'll come at 6 o'clock to celebrate with us.
Is that a self-nomination thing? And then
We ask for
mayor
nominations
picks the ones
in July, and we get them from both the actual property owners or architects or developers, as well as anybody can nominate anything in the city. We get them internally, we get them from random community members or neighborhood groups. And this year we do have a new category called Neighborhood Gem, for which we will be awarding several community projects and places that the community felt was really a great addition to their neighborhood.
Thanks, Andrea. So there's a cash bar and full cheese tomorrow night, and it's a great follow-up to this session that you participated in today. So I'm just pulling it up here. It is in the Chambers Grand Salon at Kevin Taylor's at the Opera House at the Denver Performing Arts Complex. So had all the right words. So if you know your way there, you can make your way there for the event starting at 6. Again, the website denvergov.org/MDA. All right. So we've got half an hour for this. That's about it. 25 minutes for this next portion of the evening. I'm going to let Heather and Kyle describe for you the hands-on activity.
Great. So very, very quickly. The questions were very pertinent to our hands-on exercise because we're going to ask you to consider potential rezoning. We've got two different scenarios. One is happening over and over and over up in northwest Denver, which is what is happening to all these old, underutilized, even vacant church sites in our neighborhoods. And so two groups are going to be asked to look at the existing conditions and zoning tools.
These two groups.
These two groups. And decide whether or not you would advocate and approve and support a rezoning of church. And then two tables on this side are going to look at what we call urban residential neighborhood. So envision 2 to 3 to 4 or 5-story multi-family apartment units. And somebody's come in and wants to build a new multi-family structure, but they want to put commercial development in the street level. And so we're giving you all the zoning tools that are available right now in the form of maps on your table. And Kyle, do you want to walk them through?
So each group is going to work on your own, and then we'll do a report back at the end. So pick somebody to describe for you and be prepared to report back. But we've got two of the same on one side of the room and two of the same on the other, so we can hear from the different groups and see if they reach a different conclusion. So the folks over on the kind of southwest side of the room, you have the church rezoning. And you've got 4 maps. You've actually got 2 copies of the 4 maps just to share around the table that kind of lay out the kinds of things that we would look at as planners to help inform your recommendation to council. So first, you've got a land use map that shows the existing conditions, what the existing use of the land is, and the scale of buildings in the area. You've got Blueprint Denver. So in that fictional neighborhood, what does Blueprint Denver say? You've got information there about whether it's an area of stability or area of change, what the Blueprint Denver future plan recommendation is for the area. You've got zoning, and you've got a little key to what the zoning is. So what do the current rules allow? And then you've got a neighborhood plan, except there's no neighborhood plan adopted. So you got nothing to go from on your neighborhood plan. They don't have one. That's one of those. Big portion of the city that Steve Allen had up in red last week, or 2 weeks ago. They don't have a neighborhood plan. So you have to go on Blueprint Denver, and that's the area. And then, so based on what you know, identify what else you think you would need to know, and also based on those criteria in your worksheet, whether you think the church should be rezoned. So that's this side.
We just had a really great question because these are fictitious sites. So somebody said, where is this in the city? And they're not located in the city. They're, the streets are A, B, C, and D, and 1, 2, 3, 4.
Thank you. Yeah, good question. So this side does not allow commercial. And then you've got a neighborhood plan. So here there's someone they've got a neighborhood plan. You need a lot more direction about the kinds of the goals and objectives of the neighborhood plan to help guide your decision.
So each table has a worksheet. So the first thing you need to do is look at your Blueprint Denver maps. Is it in the area of stability or change? What is the land use? Look at the zoning. What zone district is it in? Is there a neighborhood plan? And if there is a neighborhood plan, what is the land use? So this is a fill in the blank exercise on the left. And then exercise number 2 is using your own words. Imagine what this looks like and describe it. What is the context? How tall are the structures? What kind of uses is this parcel surrounded by? And then your recommendation down in the bottom. Would you advocate and support a rezoning request for this particular parcel, for this particular use, and if so, and why? We want you to back up your answer there. Yes?
Is our assumption in the church group that the church is not being used as a church?
So there's a problem statement at the very top.
Oh,
okay. That's the problem statement. So somebody's coming forward, and I believe they would like to rezone it to a commercial use that permits daycare. That is your problem statement.
All right. So be a planner, and then we'll report back.
Did you have a question?
What uses are allowed now? What uses are allowed for the youth?
Single family development. Oh, on that site?
Yeah, within that zone district, today the USUC, which is at the bottom, it allows single unit, it also allows churches, schools, parks, and single districts.
Schools are allowed.
Schools are allowed, not daycare.
The exterior of the building.
So here, you're officially assigned group number 1. So we would like to hear from you. And if you could just, because you're going first, read the problem statement so the folks who were focused on the church understand what you were doing. And then we want to hear your recommendations, item 4 or opposition 2, and then why.
All right, so our problem statement for rezoning for a new cafe was the property is located in an existing residential neighborhood where single-family homes have been converted to apartments interspersed with old and new apartment and condo buildings. A few blocks away, there are existing mixed-use commercial corridors with small businesses and offices. The property's current use is a 3-story apartment building with 5 parking spaces. The applicant is asking to rezone the property to allow a small ground floor neighborhood serving coffee shop in the existing building. So, for our Blueprint Denver, the area of stability, area of change, we've got high density urban residential, may include commercial, complementary commercial uses. For Blueprint Denver, what is the land use? Denver urban land and use? Oh, skip right there?
Yeah.
Okay, we're not going over exercise. Okay, so recommendation. So we just took a vote on it. Because we're going back and forth on it. We decided we'd do an or no vote. So on a quorum of 5 individuals, 4 supported, 1 opposed. So the 4 of us that supported, we believe it fits into the neighborhood plan. It creates a synergy of the neighborhood. It's a place to gather. It activates the street with neighbors. And because it's high density, it's most likely a neighborhood with a lot of walkability. So people are going to be walking to the coffee shop, so it's probably not going to be an issue with parking. 1 opposed, and that could be, they oppose because you open Pandora's box. You allow commercial business, later on, all of a sudden, in a year, you could have a completely different commercial business. So that was the opposition.
Great,
All right.
thank you.
You're welcome for that.
Good job. Number 2.
Group number 2 had the same challenges table number 1 had. I'm going to describe the first half of the conflict section, and someone else from my team is going to take the recommendations. The proposed project is located in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. Very diverse. The local registered neighborhood organization is the Capitol Hill United Neighborhood Association. And what the local city council representative is going to do. The demographics of the community are residents of mixed income, very diverse, consisting primarily of bikers, hikers, and trikers with dogs. Very well established. Somebody can review the recommendations on this project. Volunteer. Robert?
All right, so our recommendation is, opposed to the other group which just took a vote within the RNO, is we'd like to incorporate all the neighbors, especially the immediately adjacent neighbors, and have them vote or have a period to express their feelings for or against such project. If it did have their support and we felt the change of use would incorporate their concerns, most likely density and parking, we would recommend rezoning to GRX 5, I believe is, so that's a first story residential and multi-use where the first story would be commercial. But we'd also consider the option of going to GX 3 or inventing such a because it's a 3-story building. It would reduce the likelihood that it's scraped and expanded out in the future.
Okay, thanks. So this is the church site.
Can you hear me without a microphone? Yeah.
No.
Okay. Remember I told you I'm allergic to microphones? The property is located in an existing residential neighborhood with some homes dating back to the early 1900s, plus some newer. A few blocks away, there's a grocery store, gas station, and small businesses. The property's current use is a church with about 16 parking spaces. The applicant is asking to rezone the property for a privately owned daycare facility under commercial zoning, such as UMX2X. So do you only want me to go over what we said, our decision?
Just your recommendation.
Okay. So we also took a vote, and it was kind of 3 and 3, and we came to a consensus with no because UMX2X, if that property in the future was sold to someone else, they could develop it into a variety of other things, almost all type of retail with very limited exception, restaurants, offices, daycares. So we're recommending no. However, we are going to recommend that they come back and ask for it to be zoned MU2, which would just allow for, that's a 2-story residential, but that the code allows for daycare under that zoning, whereas it would not allow for future retail or other use.
Do you get an extra piece of paper than we did?
We asked a lot of questions.
We stole our answers.
All right.
Recommendation, we also recommended no. What we had was a diagram of the blueprint Denver, wasn't consistent with that. There wasn't a neighborhood plan, so there wasn't another document for us to review. And we also saw that 3 blocks in either direction is already UMX2, so it seemed more appropriate for the business to probably look into where that area is already zoned for the type of business they wanted to do.
Well, Joel's trying to review, so maybe I'll take just a minute. So, these are great thoughts. I told you with today are the maps that inform the 5 criteria in the code about whether you would recommend approval or not of a map amendment. And so, the kinds of conversations that I heard at this table about what other districts might there be, though, that's the pre-application kind of conversation that Evelyn was talking about, right? If someone comes to us and you look at the plan, it's got to be consistent with the plan, it's got to be consistent with the context. What you're asking for is probably more than you need, but there may be some other thing that gets you kind of close to what the plan says, and look for other options. So we could have that easy no in the office that might be able to come up with something better that would still get you what you need, but get you to a yes at council at the end of the day. So great word, but you have to understand kind of there's so much more to know, right? What does the zoning allow? What other districts are there? What's the parking? Almost every group came up with what would happen with parking, and what would happen over time, because a zone district, can raise a right, but that could be something else in the future, and would we be okay with that something else? Those are the kinds of longer-term questions you have to think about when analyzing a zoning application. But
You're right or
great
wrong,
job.
what would you do?
Yeah, exactly.
Right or wrong, what would you
So what would the city do in most scenarios?
Yeah.
What would the zoning?
Whew. Well, I definitely would need more information.
Can I
This is
just add though
yeah.
that as I walked around, the questions that you were asking kind of fell into 2 categories. Everybody wanted to know more about the context. So if you were serving on your R&O and had this problem in front of you, somebody came to you, the rezoning, because it was happening within your R&O, chances are pretty good that you would have an inherent, instant understanding of what that context was. But then the other questions, like what is the parking, what other districts could this fall under? That's where those 2 spreadsheets that Kyle showed, that's what we have out on the table when we are looking at rezonings or variances. We have those, and they're worn, and we go through them, and we use them, like I said, pretty much at every meeting. So we're asking the exact same questions, but I think you guys did a really good job of trying to kind of fabricate a context, from a fictitious site. So I thought that this was great. So thank you.
She's trying to let you off.
So I'll say this about the churches. I think churches are some of the stickiest things we have to deal with. I was telling one of the groups about this because there are kind of 2 things happening with churches, and it's not just Denver, it's all around the country, where they're either growing old and growing smaller and closing, or they're growing big and they're expanding in ways that are no longer. Either one, what do you do with the expansion? How does it still respect the context? Or what do you do with the closed church? And how do you reuse it in a way that makes sense in a single unit residential neighborhood? What do you do with that? And it's tricky and it's tough, and I think we probably would look for something like what this table came up with. In terms of is there something else? This is one of the hardest when you don't even have a neighborhood plan. It doesn't even talk about reuse of existing structures to should be and that happens in some places. Like DPS closes a school and it converts to apartments, and the plan calls for that, and that's okay. Right? But where you don't even have that you haven't had the community conversation yet about what do we do with these institutional uses? That's one of the hardest things. Over here, I think we probably would have seen this one a little more straightforward in terms of the plan direction. I think, that table was right in terms of context is still important for year 5. But with plan calling for mixed use and with, I think some, y'all hit on the head about the densities are high enough that a lot of people won't have to drive cars in park. And again, the plan is specifically calling for mixed use. The context seems to support it. It's a little bit easier than this method. Anyway,
All right.
those are just thoughts off the top of my head.
Quick question.
Yeah, we have just a few more minutes. Actually, I want to open it up for some additional follow-up questions. I was hoping that through the conversations you had at your individual tables and the time that you had at break, you did have a chance to get most of your questions answered, but I also want to allow for some additional time for follow-up questions before we wrap things up and bring it all home.
And don't leave early.
Don't leave early.
How often, CPD gives recommendations as to what, or to city council on these projects. How often do they go against you? Or how often? I wouldn't
That makes sense, I'm gonna guess.
I wouldn't think very often.
Okay, so Evelyn's right. Order of magnitude is like 2/3 you turn away before they even so the third that are left, how many still go forward without us? Once a year, maybe.
So most of them are, most of them that do go forward have your blessing.
I remember the last time we went forward with a recommendation for denial.
A couple of years ago.
Yeah.
We had one that went to planning board and then they withdrew or something.
Yeah.
Got scared.
Next question.
At what point is neighborhood input considered while you're mulling this over? I know that neighborhoods have to give input prior to planning board, but is there anything that would help guide a neighborhood, like if a neighborhood knew that you wanted input sooner, would that make any difference? Where in the process does that happen?
Okay, great question.
So one informally and one formally. So at a pre-application meeting, which is what we do when someone says, hey, I think I want to rezone and I don't even know what I want yet. We require a pre-application meeting and they'll meet one-on-one with the planner. And the very first thing that a planner says, before you come in and apply to us, you need to talk to your neighborhood organizations and your district council person. It's not a requirement, but we say that every single meeting and we want to see them do that. So informally, we're encouraging folks to do that and reach out to the neighboring property owners even when that's relevant.
That's before there's a formal application.
That's when it's an idea in somebody's head. They're thinking about doing this, haven't even bought the property yet, maybe, or they bought it and don't know what they got into. So that's the informal way. Formally, when we receive that application, they go back, they talk to whoever, and they actually apply to us. We're required by law to immediately then, we send email notice to registered neighborhood organizations within 200 feet of the property and to the applicable city council people. So that's the first time we're providing formal notice and asking, please tell us what you think about it, long before it's even been scheduled for planning board. And then there are 3 more notices that go out where we keep asking for feedback all the way to city council.
So is there a formal process for the neighborhood to respond and to hear what you think about the neighborhood response? It seems to be murky.
Sure, yeah. So you can do it either the formal way or the informal way. We do make available, and each of the notices provides a link to where the RNO can go and fill out a position statement. The position statement follows what's set forth in law about what an RNO is supposed to do when they're weighing in on a rezoning. They're supposed to document, this many voted yes, this many voted no, who was at the meeting, that kind of thing, and then report that to us. So there's that form. Most RNOs don't do that and just write a letter or give us a call. And we'll take, every piece of feedback we receive on a rezoning application becomes a part of the public record and will be forwarded on to the decision makers for them to consider in making their decision. And for us to consider before we make a recommendation, because we don't make a recommendation until planning board, and that's intentional. We don't make a recommendation until we have to, because we want to hear everything that's out there that we should know before we have to make a final interpretation.
Maggie?
It's easy to get in the mindset, at least I found it easy to get the mindset of it's the neighbors against the developers. And so as I think about for my own neighborhood, asking for rezoning, I'm thinking, can I get me ahead of the developers, before they tear down that one house that I've seen vacant, that kind of thing. What would be your recommendations for how to communicate appropriately or not with how do you work in the world with developers? And I don't
just
mean
go
you, I
talk to
mean
them.
me.
Heather, that might be the best time.
Well, yeah, well, you answered my earlier question. When the zoning code update was happening and the draft map came out, draft zoning map came out, folks at RNO, in my RNO, got in the car and we drove every street back and forth, looking at the map, and we went up and down and we covered it. And we created a list of recommended revisions that we sent to CPD. We didn't get everything that we asked for, but we got a lot. The issues that we're addressing in the overlay district are not rezonings at all. And I feel pretty strongly that because we had a core group of people who spent the time focused on that during the zoning code update, we haven't seen as many rezonings as some other neighborhoods in Northwest Denver. We have seen some, but I would recommend getting involved at that level. But we're fortunate to have, I think, because we have a very strong RNO, that the development community is aware of that, and we have developers who sit on our board and sit and are active in our zoning committee meetings. So there are exchanges, there are heated exchanges. There is, people really dig in their heels, but I'm very proud of the fact that I can go to my councilman or CPD or Kyle and say, look, we've had these discussions, and this is one point of view and this is the other point of view, and these are some compromises that we're talking about. So the development community is engaged, but I really want to emphasize, especially with redevelopment and investment up and down Tennyson Street, nobody has come to us. Everybody is very happy. The development community is building their redeveloping within the framework of the existing zone districts. And I think, that kind of should be attributed to the effort that the RNO put in years ago when we really kind of drove back and forth. So, and we put in a lot of time and effort with the draft amendment too. So, kind of back to this group of volunteers, the more that you can advocate and recruit on behalf of your neighborhood, the more, I think, diverse your representation is at the table, and the more informative the exchanges are, and the more exchanges you have, the more everybody becomes educated about everybody's point of view at the table, and that's invaluable.
I'll just add one final thought on that. Maggie, you're in Curtis Park now, right?
Yeah, 2 blocks that way.
Yeah. So, and Joel, you're what, 3 blocks that way, right? So you've got your Curtis Park Neighbors Association, right? So that's a great avenue for having those conversations with the development community. But then taking a step back, how do you tell the developer, how do you communicate the values to the developer? A neighborhood plan is a great tool for that. And then to make sure that the zoning is consistent with the neighborhood plan. I mean, I think that's one of the key messages I want to make sure that we drive home, because if we're always reacting, we're really inefficient. We're not as effective as we can be as a community in sort of guiding the development in a manner that's acceptable. I think again, it may be an overgeneralization to say, but I think folks have come to terms with the fact that growth and change is happening. So now the conversation is, how do we stop that? How do we guide it in a way that's going to fit? And then you've seen just in these small group conversations, you've heard from Heather's description of her RNO discussions, that figuring out, how to make something fit isn't always easy, because there's, if you've got 7 people at a table, you've got 7 different opinions. Heather's talked about, to porch or not to porch as part of her overlay district for her neighborhood group. That's just in the Berkeley Regis United Neighbors neighborhood area. Imagine trying to do that for the entire city. It's a daunting task. It's a fun task. It's a challenge that luckily, we enjoy doing and we get paid to do, so it's a good job.
Do you love zoning as much as Kyle?
Who loves zoning only as much? Almost as much. So it wouldn't be a citizens academy. It wouldn't be an academy worth its salt if we didn't have some sort of piece of paper to give you at the end of this all. So I'm going to let the secret out of the bag. We've got cat out of the bag. We've got some certificates we really want to hand out to you. We had a great suggestion from the group here to have a group photo as the inaugural Denver Citizens Academy. We'd love to. So I do want to make sure that we have time for that, but I will take one more question if it's a really, really good question. This is the final one question for the Denver Citizens Planning Academy. Members who are attending the academy, not guests, Greg. I want to recognize your
Could I,
courage.
just 60 seconds, so to apply what people have learned, I don't know who picked the church example, but November 2nd, Emmaus Church rezoning in West Highlands at 32nd and Irving is in front of the city council. Divided planning board approved it. I think the neighborhood is against it. I don't know if they've done a protest petition, but it's a church being converted to high density over the objection of many neighbors. So stay tuned and watch how these themes play out before the city council.
Do you mean the church is being demolished?
It's a church parking lot. It's a parking lot.
It was a church, right?
Medical care.
So that's some great homework for you. We've got all of our city council meetings are broadcast online if you can't make it down to the council meetings itself. Do tune in and sort of put yourself in their shoes, you know, what decisions do you make? And then think about it. Are you making a decision that's right for just that neighborhood, or are you making a decision that's right for the whole city? I mean, there's a whole range of different perspectives that you bring to that. Okay, Greg used up 30 seconds of your time. We have one last question. I'm confident it's going to be a really good question. That's you. That's you. No pressure.
I'm concerned about a lot of developers. They only want to buy a property that has the zoning that they want to use. They want, in other words, they want to work within existing zoning because otherwise they've got to go through a complicated and chancy process. But there are other kinds of developers who may be able to sort of circumvent the neighborhood input process because they intend to carry out perhaps a city policy. And so they are willing to buy, perhaps with the assistance of the city, parcels which would have to be rezoned for their intended use to occur. And I think that behind the scenes, the city may say, look, we get this rezoned. And I'm concerned that this process...
What did happen in real life? I mean, the developer bought the property knowing what the existing zone was, what intended purpose. I think it's in litigation right now, so I don't know what happened. That was the scratch board project? That was the church? What development was that? Was that
I don't know about that.
But it did happen. The developer bought, knowing what the existing zone was. And city council approved.
I'm concerned that, in other words, sometimes before an application or before any pre-application, in fact, the die is already cast. And because the mayor's influence with the council may be sufficient to get whatever rezoning is wanted to carry out a policy. Am I imagining a process which does not occur?
The process that Kyle has described for you this afternoon, this evening, in terms of the rigorous review process that happens before we ready an application to bring before the decision-making bodies, taking into account neighborhood input, is the accurate description of the process. I'm not going to pretend that there aren't political forces at play because that's just the world we live in. But in terms of describing the work that we do as a planning agency, that's not. We don't take those things into consideration. Now, what your elected officials do, the folks that you've elected to represent yourselves, everybody has different perspectives and different roles to bring to a decision-making process. What we've tried to describe for you is the process that we follow, the process that, the things that we are required to look at when considering these rezoning requests. What I'm hoping that you all are doing and reflecting on for these 3 sessions is thinking about what your role is, what you bring to the conversation. And then certainly, yes, planning board members or city council members have a different perspective to bring to those decision-making processes. Like I said, I can't pretend to be an expert on what those other perspectives are, what those other forces are that are at play. What I can do is tell you with absolute certainty that the process that Kyle's described, the process that's described on our website, that 10-step process that he pointed to in it. I feel like that was kind of a downer for our last one. Let's take a picture. Let's get a photo. Does anybody have a softball, like kind of inspirational question for Michelle?
Is it possible for you to pull the room by hand and see who would like to participate in our graduate studies
Oh,
class?
right, CPA. This was planning 101, so we've had a request for planning 202.
I'll just say that this question, the answer to it is that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Because the more people that are educated to play a role in this,
Great response. Okay, let's just go with Maggie.
Why can't you legislate good things?
Evelyn, if I could just
interject something here. This is when Evelyn and I and Greg met several months ago. It was about a year ago. And we thought of Citizens Academy. This is what it was all about. Helping you get active in your registered neighborhood organization and learning to do it the right way. So I hope that this has helped. If you're not involved in your registered neighborhood organization, get involved. INC and CPD are here to help you. So with that being said, remember what I said at the beginning? Where do I fit into this and how do I get there? If we accomplish that, then it was a good job. And thank you all.